which is a really fancy title that essentially means that I'm a product-facing resource, but also a customer-facing resource. And I've been here with HashiCorp for roughly 5 years now.
So Fraser is pro Sentinel, like he'll have a lot of advanced knowledge. So feel free to add questions in the chat. As we have around, I think, 55 participants and more to join, it'll be in the interest of time if you could ask the questions in chat. And I have my wonderful TAs with me from HashiCorp today. Most of them you might have met as part of your account solution engineers. So I want to thank them all to helping me assist this workshop. If we feel that there is a specific question that's been asked very prominently and it's good for the other folks to know, we'll have one of our TAs or maybe Fraser take up the questions off mute. So now I'll get started. I'll just turn off my videos because of network connectivity issues. I have a lot of screens to be shared here. So I'll turn off my video now, and please let me know. If you have any question, feel free to put it in the chat. All right, so let's get started. As HashiCorp briefly mentioned about how the today's agenda looks like. So today I'll take you through the Sentinel for Terraform version 5. We are going to have a pretty tight agenda today. It'll be, first we'll be going through some introduction to Sentinel concepts. Then we'll talk about what exactly Sentinel is and how it works with our products, where it lives within the ecosystem and what it does. Then we would talk about how Sentinel works. So we're going to discuss about the intricacies of the language, where it propagates its data inside of Terraform, where it consumes it and uses the data, and how it centrally processes through the engine. This would lead us into our first labs, which is using Sentinel CLI. And as if you've been attending previous workshops at HashiCorp, we use Instruct as our lab platform. And essentially with Instruct, it helps us with, giving us the lab and the practice sandboxes to set up a safe place for you to experiment with all our HashiCorp products. And if you've attended that before, you would see we do have certain publicly available Instruct labs. And you could use these available Instruct labs as well as, share, and I'll be sharing these slides, or if one of the TAs could share in the chat for, referencing it later. So day one, as I said, would be mostly around the conceptual knowledge. Day two, we are going to get a little bit deeper technically into the nitty-gritties of writing some advanced technical Sentinel policies. And all in all, I'm sure it's going to be a great learning experience for you. We'll have depth around the language constructs. We are going to talk about things like maps, functions, modules, lists, etc. So let's get started with our chapter 1, Introduction to Sentinel Concepts. So briefly, as you all know, Sentinel is a policy as code language, right? It would allow you to enable fine-grained logic-based policies. Now think about all your regulatory or validation knowledge within the organization that needs to be codified, right? As we talk in terms of regulating and validating what infrastructure has been provisioned in your environment, for that, Sentinel is a policy framework and could be used to put guardrails around your infrastructure. Often now, I'm assuming like most of you have been using Terraform. So where Terraform stands as infrastructure as code and allows you to codify your infrastructure provisioning capabilities, Sentinel on the other side allows you to codify those policies or guardrails around your infrastructure. So it would take your repeatable patterns that may be in the spreadsheets or documented somewhere and allow them to codify into the form of policies. Now, Sentinel in its own language and it is embedded in HashiCorp's enterprise products. It's based out of HCL and JSON, and it not just support the fine-grained policies, but also supports the conditional logic that you could put for provisioning your infrastructure. Now, you could validate things like, hey, is this image supported? Or is this function allowed to be used inside a particular cloud? Or you could even mandate things like, hey, I have this private module registry, and you want to make sure that within your organization, you ask your employees and mandate them to use just those modules and not the publicly available modules. Other things that you could do with this is, right, you don't want to, at times, we just request about, hey, create 10 VMs, and you might even end up fat fingering it to, creating 100 VMs. So you want to avoid such situations. You could also, with a lot of cloud spend happening across the organization, as we see, you could utilize Sentinel to, avoid any overspend or underspend that's been done currently today, if it is there in your organization. So that could also be limited through the use of Sentinel. Now let's see how the Sentinel language actually looks like, right? So firstly, Sentinel is enabled as part of your provisioning workflow, ensuring that your policies are checked each time the Terraform runs, right? So for most of you who have some experience with Terraform, you know that it has a two-phase workflow, right? It's plan phase and the apply phase, where plan phase allows you to do a dry run. It provides us a guess against what's going to happen against the targeted API or the targeted provider. On the other hand, with Sentinel, it would interrupt that plan and apply workflow. So even before you apply something or deploy your infrastructure, Sentinel would give you some evaluation criteria to validate your data, to validate what you're trying to provision in your infrastructure. Right? So it also allows you to ensure all the policies are checked before every time you run your Terraform run, whether the run was automated process initiated by your pipeline or through the CLI or directly started by a user in Terraform GUI. Now look at this example here. It's a very standard organization where you would want to see their legal or regulatory requirements that the instance is of a certain type. So here it says, hey, make sure that anytime you provision, any instance type, these are the only allowed type that you could use. It could be either 350 large, 289 super small, or another super small, right? So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to use this documented Excel sheet, as you have mentioned it. I'm going to codify it using policy as code or Sentinel. So anytime my Terraform tries to use an instance type other than this specified in the policy, it would generate a caution, or it would alert us to, hey, this is not the allowed instance type you're trying to create if it does not fall against these three possible outcomes. Think of Sentinel as an automated gatekeeper to your infrastructure as code. Right? So just like infrastructure as code, there are similar benefits of policy as code. You would see benefits around managing the version history, change control, collaboration. Once I write a policy, I could even share it with anyone inside my organization. So it could allow them to iterate, consume it, and use it. Pretty much anything you can do, you can build out with Terraform, you can validate and check it using the Sentinel. The most interesting side of this is validating the policy with the mock data. So, I'll be covering what this mock data essentially means, but in a very layman terms, think of it that I can send a test or a fake data into my policy validation framework, right? To make sure what could be expected or what to expect as my infrastructure iterates through it. Let's say, start with building a VM with infrastructure as code. I could say, hey, everything inside this virtual machine needs to be evaluated with the policy code, be it naming convention, be it the different components of the VM, be it RAM, CPU, etc. It has to go through that policy check. So let me pause here and take a step back. Talking so much about Sentinel, what problem does Sentinel essentially help us to solve here? So with Sentinel, it implements the most effective security without slowing you down the pace of your business activities. The fun story is, the paradox of automation is, oftentimes we want to speed things up, but then at the same time, we forget about introducing certain guardrails or security checks. So it's just as it goes with doing things fast. We want to make sure we take things to market fast, but we forget to keep about, essential checks that are required. Now, at the same time, if you are introducing a security or policy checks, you don't want to be, a gatekeeper validating with manual checks, matching them with what's documented in your Excel sheets. And at the same time, you want to add more controls and check in your environment before things are getting deployed. So, right, it's the irony or the paradox. You want things fast, you want things secured, you don't want to go manual. So what's the benefit of all of this, With the help of having a consistent workflow, or with the help of having an automated security check, you have more control over your environment, right? You have, with the help of that consistency, you are able to monitor any anomalies or anything that goes outside of the box, or any notorious employee who's trying to create or overspend something, or doesn't have to be notorious, but you're trying to test out some infrastructure and then you forget about deleting it, or it's just hanging in there, increasing to your cloud cost. You don't want to do any such event, right? So that's where automating and having an automated pipeline with security checks in places are helpful. Any questions so far, or anything that my TAs or Fraser that you would want to add? All right, so let's go over a few specific use cases that we see across HashiCorp customers. Now, these are some real use cases as I talk about. One great example is HashiCorp customers are using Sentinel to enforce the security standards. They need encrypted S3 buckets, or they want to validate the ACL endpoints. They want to make sure these particular resources do not have access to the outside world. They want to prohibit or restrict certain users, that they should not be using the providers, but they should be using the providers which are HashiCorp regulated. They don't want to be using certain partner or open source providers. So these are few things, this is one of the many use cases that we see our customers using it. So if you see, here's a great example that for the allowed list of providers, here is the allowed list that says it could be AWS, the provider could be AWS, local, null, random, Terraform, TFE. Similarly, you can do something similar for GCP, Azure, VMware along the way. Another great example is, again, as I talked about, avoiding the cloud spend or excessive cloud costs. You want to limit the sizes of your virtual machines. You want to limit the sizes of your Kubernetes cluster in public clouds, right? You also want to make sure that you are limiting the monthly spend of specific of your Terraform workspace, right? Think of it like I have one workspace that's taking care of building my storage. You don't want to be overspending or creating some bleeding resources inside that. So you could utilize Sentinel for that purpose as well. Another example could be, enforcing mandatory tags. Often we have, a lot of orphaned resources hanging in there in the cloud, adding to our cloud costs. So let's say, for example, my cost center or my regulatory team says, hey, I don't want any of these resources to be to go untagged. So you want to enforce mandatory tag using Sentinel policies. Then another example, as I talked about, was mandating the use of modules as they are available in your private module registry. Now, here's another good example for the organizations who are just getting started with the use of cloud, right? You just want the resources you want the virtual machines of these types. Like you just want AWS instance, it could be an Azure virtual machine, it could be a Google Compute instance. Essentially, you're restricting your employees, saying, hey, we are just getting started. We are going cloud native, but okay, let's take baby steps. Let's start with creating instances. I don't want you to create some bleeding resources that could cost us a huge sum. Example, storage or some networking resource. So you want to restrict the use as you crawl, walk, and run in your cloud space. Again, now, I want to take a step back. There are certain limitations that Sentinel does not do in Terraform, okay? Sentinel is a proactive validation for your infrastructure. That's true, check. It lives between the plan and apply phase for your Terraform, check. However, it doesn't go back and check your infrastructure to validate compliance. You can't turn on Sentinel and sweep it clean with what was ever built with Terraform. You can't do that, right? It also doesn't remove those existing resources that violate certain policies. It won't go back vacuuming anything that's already existing and causing any issue with your standing policy. it also does not ensure that resources attributes are valid. Let's say, for example, it can't check if you have an instance type saying super large big instance. It can't just go back and say, is it a valid type or not, right? However, it could check through the allowed list of instance types and say that, okay, this was not there, but it wouldn't know if super large big instance allowed type was is allowed or not, right? Another example is you could have, suppose you have a key for your S3 bucket, but Sentinel would not have a way to say, is it a valid key or not, right? Another limitation is analyzing or limiting the runtime actions of your deployed application. It doesn't do any, it doesn't do anything with, image or application level validation. It cannot go into your individual application or validate that the application is running in an expected way. All right. So again, I said what were the limitations, but now let's talk about how helpful it could be or where Sentinel is used in Terraform. So anytime you initiate a run in Terraform Cloud or Terraform Enterprise, you typically have the first iteration of plan, right? The next you see is will be the cost estimation. So if you're not aware, Terraform Enterprise and Cloud has this capability of enabling cost estimation to say, just after the Terraform plan phase, it could tell you what could be the outstanding or a dry run of your infrastructure could cost, right? So the next step after Terraform plan is cost estimation. Following the cost estimation is the policy check, if enabled, right? And then is the Terraform apply, or when the deployment of infrastructure will happen. So again, so policy can have different enforcement levels, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later. But just be aware that you could define different enforcement checks, different level of enforcement checks for your policies. A most important thing to note here is Sentinel policies can evaluate the large slot of values that comes from Terraform. Not only the resource that are part of existing run, but any of the variables that are configured inside Terraform Cloud or Terraform Enterprise, right? So you could get data from plan, you could get data from your Terraform configurations. This is, as I go forward in the conversation in the slides, you would see how to generate the mock data that you can use it, right? So you could use data from your plan, you could use data from your Terraform configuration, you could essentially query the data of your current state using Sentinel or any other run data that's part of Terraform Cloud or Enterprise solution. So this would ensure that the resources comply with all the policies before their provision, right? So in a way, in a nutshell, I would say Sentinel is, essentially proactively release tool. So it validates everything before you provision the infrastructure. All right, so far I've been talking a lot of things around with the definitions, how and what. Now we'll see how things are done more programmatically and via the designs. Where does the Sentinel lives inside Terraform? So typically, specifically pointing out, if you're using Terraform open source, typically with Terraform on your local systems, you go through the plan and apply phase. You check in your code with the version control system, and then you go through the plan and apply phase iteration before you provision your infrastructure. With Sentinel, you interrupt that workflow of plan and apply, breaking them into two separate constructs. What this allows us to do is take or import the data from this plan, import it, use it to check against our Sentinel policy checks, right? So policy checks would again happen previous to the apply on target infrastructure, which is different from most validation tool sets, where we often listen our customers saying, hey, currently in our ecosystem, we are doing the validation after the fact or after the deployment. This helps us shifting a little bit left when you're doing all the checks, you're doing all the policy checks even before you're deploying your infrastructure, making it more secured, right? So essentially preventing you from making those regulatory infrastructure mistakes. So let's look, how does all of this, I showed you how the workflow looks like. Let's see how it looks like in Terraform Enterprise or Cloud. If you have Enterprise or Cloud in your system, you might have seen how an essential, Terraform run looks like. You'll notice once the plan is finished, it gives you some cost estimation values, as I mentioned, right? Then it looks at the policy checks that were passed. And as you would notice, policy check comes right before the apply phase. My bad. It just comes right before the apply phase. And all of this data is actually archived and validated and stored within your enterprise, Terraform Enterprise or Cloud solution. So all this data can be consumed. It can be queried via the API. And if you're integrating with other solutions like CI/CD pipeline or validating or testing suites, query this data as part of your infrastructure provisioning path. So, okay, so once all the policy checks have passed, this is how the UI looks like. If you have ever seen it in the Terraform Cloud, you would see you are first, validating an individual policy. You're going to see the Sentinel result, right? Whether it was passed true or false. Then the policy, it will give you a brief information about the policy that we are evaluating, summary of those particular policies. You would also see the enforcement levels, right? Again, I've been saying like a broken record. I'll be getting into the details about the enforcement levels, different type of enforcement levels we have. And most importantly, all of this information can be downloaded as part of your raw logs, right? So it would come out as a JSON format. So essentially, if you could pass this on to any of your auditing or logging requirement solutions. Then finally, there you go. You have the different type of Sentinel policy enforcement levels. So talking about firstly the advisory, right? So advisory is more like, cautionary. Hey, it would log the violations, but it would just allow you to proceed with it, right? The next is the soft mandatory. This can be overridden by the authorized user. So if you have Terraform Cloud and Enterprise, we have a very strong defined role-based access control system, and it would allow you to note some of your users to be defined as the policy enforcers and the policy granters. Let me jump to this statement before I get the hard mandatory. So as the customers go through, the maturity process of consuming these Sentinel or the policy as code, we even might want to start with, advisory levels. So just that you don't go about, turning off everyone's infrastructure provisioning capability. Hey, you can't do this, you can't do that. Let's begin with, preventing the provisioning of something, let's say, really large infrastructure. Let's begin by giving them a cautionary or advisory thing that, hey, I'm allowing you to do it right now, but going forward on this date, on a specific date, we would be restricting or having a soft mandatory. Like if you're provisioning an extra large EC2 instance, only the policy, like the enforcers can allow you to, pass that on, like just override that. Otherwise, until this specific date, you're allowed to you're given a heads up that this is coming soon. And essentially, as you transition into a much secure environment, you start adapting Terraform, policy as code or Sentinel in your environment. You want to begin with hard mandatory. Like you cannot override. There is a hard stop at creating a little bit too big infrastructure. So you want to do a hard mandatory there. So you are preemptively, starting with warning your user that you'll soon be enforcing policies going forward. And eventually it gives Terraform coders some time to adapt and modify their code. So that's why these different policy enforcement levels, right? All right, so this is one great example, so I would say a lot of things, a lot of libraries, if you have seen, there is this creator, Roger Berlin. He's no longer with HashiCorp, but he's the wholesome everybody of creating these libraries, huge policy sets, and introducing Sentinel at HashiCorp, right? So here is a great example that we have for a soft mandatory policy check. Like just after the plan was finished, there was a warning that, hey, unless somebody approves of it, what you're trying to deploy, unless somebody approves it, you cannot override it. So Roger is saying, okay, N1 standard 1 could be even cheaper. So I'm allowing it right now, but going forward, make sure you do not use a big instance there, right? So that's a great example. And I think most of it, if you have seen in Terraform Cloud or Enterprise, you might have already seen this happening. Again, I'm going through the, as we have, like, I see 63 participants joined us. I just want to level set some information. I know I'm going through a little bit basics, but going forward, we'll have much more advanced details about how things go in and about, or how you write advanced Sentinel policy checks, right? So talking about Sentinel policy sets and policy. So when you're looking at your Terraform Enterprise and Cloud, you have the ability to group your policies into policy sets for workspaces, right? Now you could even enforce that this policy set should be applied to all your workspaces, or just one specific or a limited set of workspaces. So you have that capability with Terraform Cloud Enterprise or Enterprise. Then another important piece to understand here is Sentinel does allow you to allow a policy author to supply certain parameters to help facilitate the policy reuse, so that he doesn't have to, hard code certain sensitive values into the policies. So that's another capability as well. And I would be talking a little bit detail into that as I talk about HTTP import. All right. So that brings us to the chapter summary. We have completed with chapter 1. And just a recap of things we learned about, Sentinel is a policy as code framework. Terraform code automatically runs Sentinel checks between plan and apply. So if you're using open source, or if you do not have the governance plan for Terraform Cloud, you won't be able to see this policy check passed step in your environment. Sentinel has different enforcement levels like advisory, soft, hard, mandatory, right? And chapter 1 complete. Again, thanks to Fraser. So he has added these references at the end of each chapter. So I think you should have, let me quickly check. You should have certain, Hazel, did you? Okay, so Raf did share the Sentinel slides with you all. So you have the Sentinel slides for reference, as well as these references, which could be, which could be used as Sentinel manuals going forward. So feel free to download them as you go through the slides. All right, so before I start with chapter 2, any question? I know it's been a little bit basic. I won't say Sentinel 101. It is going to get a little bit hard going forward, but chapter 1 was fairly easy. So any questions you have so far? I do not see a lot of things coming up in the chat, but Fraser, if you would want to come off mute and any detail that I might have missed out and you want to add to it.
No, I think you fully summarized. So just an introduction to the capabilities and the theology behind Sentinel. And as we go through, we'll be introducing the basics and starting to build some of the policies. I put some references into the slides, Roger's blog and content, and similarly 50-ish examples. So if you just want to copy and paste Sentinel without understanding some of the capabilities, you can absolutely do that as well. It's a good way to get started.
All right, so let's get started.
It seems like that the links are not copy pastable, at least based on the version
of the chat, or on the slide.
The chat.
On the slide.
No, the chat.
You can click on them.
They will open up in a
web browser. Yeah.
It doesn't.
Are you on a VPN or something that limits HTTP access?
I'm on a VPN, correct, but I don't know if there's any limitations there.
Okay.
I can't even select the text
on the side.
Copy paste either. So.
Hey Fraser, I think my voice is echoing. Okay, can everybody go off mute? So go on mute so it doesn't echo the voice. Okay, I am checking in the chat. When I click on it, it doesn't allow me to copy, but again, it directly opens up. So I think, Hetal or Amit, if you could take a quick look at it, why that's been disabled. Otherwise, to all the participants, we have these links. So once we have the recording ready, there'll be an email going out to all the participants with all the essential links. So we'll make sure to hand those as well. All right, so without further ado, let's get started with how Sentinel works, or chapter 2. Right, so far we have covered what Sentinel is, where it resides in Terraform. Now let's look at the concepts and the policies here. So Sentinel has the ability to check any resource inside Terraform and externally. I'll explain a little bit into detail when I say it could check any resource externally as well. So Sentinel is embedded in all of our enterprise solutions. So like I said, if you're not using cloud or enterprise, you won't be able to see that policy check passed step in your in your application or Terraform apply or Terraform runs, and even with the other enterprise products that we have. So essentially, the more HashiCorp you use, you'll get more value out of Sentinel or policy as code. Now, talking about import, the concept of import, and it is essentially importing is the ability to gather data from another solution and bring it into Sentinel. So like I said briefly, I could get the data from Terraform plan, Terraform configuration, like variables or run IDs, or any of the pre-configured information that I have used to do the Terraform run. And again, the actual Terraform run in itself. I could even import the data from that as well. So when I talked about, Sentinel has the ability to check resources externally as well. HTTP import comes into play, right? For example, think of it as a wget or a call externally to any validation URL and get that data and validate against that data using Sentinel, right? So this is a huge diagram, but it gives you a little bit deeper insight into, the Sentinel engines, what goes behind the scene of Sentinel engine. So this engine of Sentinel, think of it as a validation pipeline. There is this huge validation pipeline whose inlet is anyone within your organization who is trying to provision the infrastructure, right? And the goal of this validation pipeline is to allow any validated or any validated infrastructure as code to pass through it, right? It's just a little bit more imaginary that I'm trying to convey here, like an inlet that could, the inlet where the validation pipeline, where the inlet is essentially anybody within your organization who is trying to provision an infrastructure. So, and at the end, you want to have the goal or a validated infrastructure as code, right? These validation pipelines are automated to check for your rules, which could be, a logic or a finely grained policies. So in the diagram that you see here, on the left, I'm going to start running my Terraform. And in this particular instance, I have invoked a plan, a Terraform plan. And then there is a couple of different places that I just mentioned we can retrieve the data from, be it, your Terraform plan, Terraform configuration, data from your Terraform state, and so on and so forth. So once I import that data, I'm going to do some checks on that data. Now, this check could be a positive check that, hey, allow these XYZ ports to pass through it. Or it could be a negative check, like do not allow the mentioned list of ports or do not allow the mentioned list of instance type to be in the code, to be in your Terraform deployment code. Then I'm going to validate this data with some build rules. Now, these build rules could be, are these ports enabled or not enabled? Is this workspace tagged? Like, these are few examples of how the build rules would look like. Are these ports enabled or not enabled? Is this workspace tagged for public facing projects or is it not tagged for that? So if you think about it, it's essentially going to do, whether the data passes that rule or whether it does not pass the rule. Then you go through the validation loop of saying whether you want to allow it as a soft mandatory or a hard mandatory or an advisory. Right? You could even have, you can even build Boolean connection between these rules to help make a decision, right? The best way to enable and start consuming is to validate this in an automated fashion, right? Policy or automation framework in this process of, scaling up the individuals in our organization that has the expertise to know these requirements. We do not want to impede them or, be a gatekeeper for that. So a lot of this I'll be covering in the detail, and as Fraser takes up, he'll be getting into the details of that, and you would see things in action. Then what you see in this diagram, like what does a Sentinel check looks like? We have created, HashiCorp has this Sentinel playground, which is more like, it could be used to simulate the Sentinel check lifecycle in a non-production way. So on the left side that you see is a simple set of policies, right? On the right, you would see I have some mock data here. This will be the data, or think of it as a presupposed or a pre-provisioned data for my infrastructure, right? And on the bottom, you would see how the expected output looks like. So now this is, with Sentinel Playground, when you start using it, it will give you a visualization of what it looks like when it goes through this process, So that's an easy way to get started with Sentinel. It's just a, a playground or a simulated way to test out your policies. If anybody from the TAs, if you could share that link to Sentinel Playground so that the participants can take a look at it. All right, from the Terraform Cloud UI perspective or Terraform Enterprise UI perspective, it looks a bit more like this. Remember, we looked at the slides previously about various stages of Terraform where we had the plan and apply. In Terraform UI, there is a workspace, right? It goes through the plan, and in the plan, I'm going to give out some mock data that you would like to consume in your Sentinel. Right? With tfplan, we can see the resource map. Like if you see here, we could easily see the resource mapping. So we would know exactly how to call that specific resource. So suppose if I go about calling tfplan.module namespace .path, I can get that field out of the mock. So you could easily query it this way. You could see the path and exact resources that you would like to consume in your Sentinel. Right? Then in this example, if you see, we are trying to test whether an S3 bucket is private or not. If it is private, perfect. Go ahead and get through the apply loop. And if it is not, then we get into the loop whether you get an exception and get it approved, like I mentioned about soft mandatory, like there is an exception and you are approved for now, or if you're going to have a hard stop or a stop the pipeline, we cannot let you further to deploy this infrastructure. So this is what, in the later exercises, you would see, we'll be using the Sentinel Playground, ingest into the pipeline, take some mock data and validate against the Sentinel tests. How can we get started? So a couple of key things here. Sentinel supports a CLI for testing, right? It just needs some mock data. I would talk about what are the different type of mock data, how can you get that in the following slides. Then Terraform has a plan method that lets you preview the changes. And let's see, so let's get started with some mock data and learning about different type of it and using it in Sentinel. So this is how you would see, let's talk about the mocks, and this is how the mock data would look like and how it could be utilized in Terraform. All right, so Sentinel mocks in Terraform. So in Terraform Cloud, you are going to create a mock data with this download Sentinel mocks, essentially coming from the Terraform plan. So these mocks can be edited to simulate other data. So let's say, for example, like in Azure, when you're naming the resource groups, there are certain, you want to have certain validations around it. So you could add certain regex in your policies and make sure that your resource groups are named appropriately, and you have certain space, you do not have certain spaces and things like that. Sorry, I just heard if Hetal, the participants screen just popped up. So did anybody go off mute and want to have any question? Does have any question? Okay.
Not that I can see right now. But if anybody has any questions, please pop them into the chat screen, please.
Yep. So using the Sentinel CLI with mocks it's going to speed up the development. Development of your new policy, since additional plans do not need to be run, right? So you'll see a lot of this coming, and as we discussed in the further slides. And then there are also ways, as I talked about Roger, who has written this entire library of policies that are already existing that could be utilized in your environment right now. So if one of the TAs can share that GitHub link where we have all the policies mentioned, that will be helpful. So take a look how he has generated certain policies for GCP, Azure, and AWS and VMware, and there are multiple generations of it. So Fraser would be talking about them shortly. Let's look at how does these mock data look like. So it's a very high level of it. Once you download those, download the Sentinel mocks, you would see a huge JSON coming out of it. But if you talk about a simple block of it, it would give you everything from the version, from the variable configurations to the resources that are being updated and modified, right? So just like the Terraform plan, the mock data will give you a significant amount of data. There are nothing inside of Terraform that you cannot be queried and validated in Sentinel. Like I talked about, with Terraform plan, you could query that data. With Terraform configurations, you could query that data. Then similarly for Terraform state and Terraform runs. So these are the multiple types of mock data that can be generated. So there you go. So this is the slide that talks about different types of Sentinel mocks in Terraform. Starting with Terraform plan mock, this would give you the data generated from Terraform plans, plain and simple. With Terraform config mock, this would give you the data from Terraform configuration, be it your variables, your run IDs, etc. Then we have the Terraform state mock data, which would give you the data about your current state of a workspace, do some validation pre and post. And this is a great way where Terraform state could help, right? Then we have the Terraform run mock. Essentially, you could, this gives the metadata for Terraform runs, including the cost estimation data. So these are some policies might use more than one of these imports as well. So you'll see that doing in the examples as we have the lab exercises for you. Any questions so far? Anything asked in the chat that we could discuss over the call? Otherwise, I can continue with the slides. Okay, so here are a little bit, one example of each for different type of Terraform Sentinel policies. First one that we see here is policies can use tfplan import. So essentially, this would restrict specific attributes of specific resources in your current Terraform plan. For example, in this example that you're seeing here, get all the Azure Security Center pricing, validate inside the plan, and make sure there are proper types of subscription pricing attached to it, associated with it. So that's what this example is doing here. Then we have Terraform config import. So this would restrict the configuration of your Terraform modules, variables, resources, data sources, providers, provisioners, and outputs. So for example, as we talk about, the list of allowed resources, like, as I said, with the crawl, walk, run, as you're getting started with this, Sentinel policy usage, you just want to get started with, hey, this is the allowed list of resources that you could create. It could be AWS instance, it could be an Azure virtual machine, or a Google Compute instance. Then we have the Terraform state import. So this would check whether the previously provisioned resource or the data sources have attributes with values that are no longer allowed. So this is a great way to start introducing the different enforcement levels, such as advisory, soft mandatory, or hard mandatory. Then we have the Terraform run import. So this essentially checks the workspaces and run the metadata and checks whether the cost estimate for planned resource are within the limits. For example, determine whether the proposed monthly cost, check whether or not you're trying to exceed if you're trying to exceed or going forward, right? So just you can check that with this one. This is one of the examples. So here we have the chapter summary. We talked about how Sentinel can import data from several sources in Terraform and Terraform Cloud. So these are Terraform plan. It could be data from Terraform configuration, data from Terraform state, or Terraform run data. You could even simulate this life cycle by using the mocks, and these mocks can be generated from Terraform Cloud, or it can be then tested using the Sentinel CLI. We even talked about how HashiCorp has this Sentinel playground for simulating your policies and testing it through the mock data. So this comes to the end of chapter 2 complete. Again, following that, we have these references, and you should be able to download this material. This is just, adding some much detailed resources or much detailed blogs where you could read information about, Sentinel imports, generating the mock data. We even have our Learn documents, so you could refer them as well. So, yep. So workshop 1, I think we could take a 10 minutes break before we get started with our workshop. I think we have had 1 hour so far completed with two chapters. So this is a good pace, I feel. But feel free to put any questions. We could take a 10 minutes break before we come back and get started with workshop 1. Otherwise, if you have any question, come off mute or put it in the chat that we could discuss about.
So let's go ahead and do a 15-20 minute break.
Yep, sounds good. Good. So the first one we'll be going through is using the Sentinel CLI. Now, as I mentioned before, we'll be using the Instruct Lab. Hopefully, so one second. So let me share the link here in the chat. So there you go. So click on this link. Hopefully you are signed up to Instruct. If not, take some time to sign up for Instruct, and then again come back and click on this link, and you would be directed to something as a study room, right? So let me give you an example here. Like if I go here, it'll say, since I've already created the user, it'll say, hey, accept the HashiCorp terms, add the labs to my study room. Once I do this, I'll see some available content here. So for this starting workshop, we'll be using Sentinel CLI basics. Okay, so 2 challenges. It says it would take 60 minutes, but I would argue it should take like just 30 minutes, and you should, or maybe even less. So you could get started. So you would see just, 2 of these challenges. So the Sentinel CLI and run your first Sentinel policy. You would see full-fledged, instructions. Now, one request is that I would highly recommend do not just copy paste the commands. I know we clearly call out the commands to be mentioned in the, to be used, but read the content. There is a lot of information that you would need to understand. So read the instruction properly. Do not skip any step. Another piece of advice, make sure that you're using Google Chrome. The Instruct platform works the best with Google Chrome. Another advice that if you have your organization VPNs running, often it comes up with some issues like this lab wouldn't load or it would not come up. So just make sure that you're able to do that as well. So try it out. Again, we'll have we'll open the breakout rooms with the TAs for each of the breakout rooms. So you could ask questions, ask for any assistance as you need. We are trying our best to group the colleagues or the employees from one company together in one breakout room. So feel free to come off mute and ask questions in your breakout rooms with the TAs. Yeah, anything else? So yeah, instruct basics, applying and testing. So yeah, again, this is what we are doing with the run your first Sentinel policy, and then we get started with the chapter 3. So I would request, I think, HashiCorp or Amit, if you could open the breakout rooms, set the timer for 30 minutes. We'll do a health check in between if how many rooms have completed. And then once you have completed Sentinel CLI basics, pause there, complete these 2 labs and just pause there for a while before we get back. And then Fraser would take up the chapter 3 and the following chapters. Any questions, any trouble you're having accessing Instruct platform, let us know. If you're good to open the breakout rooms, HashiCorp, Amit, let's get started. Stop the share. Okay.
Amit has already sorted out the breakout rooms and we should all be assigned shortly.
Yep. This one was just get you familiar with, let's say, Instruct platform, because the first 2 labs were fairly easy. And hopefully you got through the even odd example as well. Now I am handing it over to Fraser to take up the rest of the session. But all the TAs, and I'll now continue to be the TA for the remaining session. So feel free to put the questions and let's get started.
Yeah, just double checking everybody can see my screen.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so we have 3 outstanding questions from the workshop that I wanted to address. One is, do I have the ability to apply a policy from the high level down, but exclude specific workspaces? No, this isn't a function yet currently. It is something we're exploring. There's a significant refactor with the role-based access controls inside of Terraform Enterprise coming in the second half of this year. And I'd encourage you to all work with your account teams if you're interested and see the Terraform Enterprise roadmap. The second question that we see is, are there any starting frameworks such as CIS, PCI, et cetera? Unfortunately, no. However, there was reference both in the slideware and in the chat information relating to Roger Berlin's starting policies framework. I would highly recommend it. It has over 50 or 60 or 70 policies that are copy and pastable. And all you'll have to do is modify the variables, as we'll discuss here very shortly. Any other questions before we get started with chapter 3 today? Awesome, fantastic. So we're going to go over introducing a policy now. So we're going to talk about the basic building blocks of a policy. Generally speaking, there's 3 major building blocks. One is your imports, the next is your basic evaluation, and then finally the output. We're also going to talk about the concept of common functions. So we talked a little bit about Roger Berlin and some of the common functions that he's written. There's also a section of common functions inside of Sentinel. So these are abilities or controls or methods that you would use throughout your policies inside of Sentinel. And then we're going to talk a little bit about getting started of writing your own policies from scratch. So we're going to talk a little bit about the advanced Sentinel language and some of the components and pieces inside of there. First up, we're going to go over your very first Sentinel policy. So you've seen some high-level examples, you've seen some pieces, you saw the pass-fail test inside of the Instruct lab where you did the even and odd, but now we're actually going to dive into a real policy and talk about both the components and the pieces that exist inside of there. So generally speaking, and now not all of policies follow this and not all checks follow this, but generally speaking, these are the 5 or 6 major criteria of a policy. First off, you have your imports, what data you're bringing into the policy. Then you have your criteria to evaluate against, whether or not that's positive or negative. So for example, I want to validate all of the right ports to use, or I want to validate all of the ports not to use. Then I would like to validate against what resources. So this is point number 3. So find all of the images, find all of the security groups, find all of the ports that are in use. And then I want to finally evaluate. So take all of the criteria in number 2, evaluate it against all of the resources in number 3, complete the test and print that out to the end user. So we're going to go through all of these steps in the next couple of slides here. So first up, this is the very first policy you'll be seeing from Sentinel. At a high level, what this allows you to do is look through all of the Terraform existing inside your organization and validate that it is only building AWS instances, Azure virtual machines, and Google Compute instances. So this is a quick check to validate that you're only building the minimum instances. You'll notice at the beginning, we're doing an import here, and I'm going to highlight in colors, as you see here, where these resources are chained together. So for example, this allowed list is loaded here and then re-referenced in the violating resources down here. So first up, what is an import? An import is any type of data, functionality, or capability that you import into Sentinel. So you've been exposed to a couple of different kinds of imports already from Nikita. First of which was the Terraform plan. So the ability to bring in the plane data, configuration, and run mocks are all examples of imports. Similarly, you can import specific functions, capabilities, and libraries. So imports in Sentinel are similar to those of other languages. So if you've ever programmed with Java, .NET, Python, for example, Ansible, Chef, Puppet, importing essentially allows you to access reusable libraries or external data and functions. Now, there's a couple of basic functionalities that Sentinel provides out of the box. So for example, you can import the JSON capability, which allows you to parse a JSON document. Remember that most, if not all, of Terraform is configured in HCL, which is an abstraction layer above the JSON. Similarly, Sentinel is built and consumed in the same language as well. And you can also use an import to consume common functions built by power users. So this is what we were referring to when we said, hey, here's some starting functionalities or starting capabilities. So I believe Amit pasted it into the chat here again. Let's say, for example, there is someone in your organization, in our organization, it's Roger, but there's somebody inside of your organization who is highly capable of writing at Sentinel. They can build a shared library of capabilities or functionalities. Let's say, for example, you wanted to vend out the enforcement and regulation of some of your organization to an end user. What you can do is provide a centralized location for them to access functions and get those from the end user. Similarly, the private and public modules are moving towards supporting Sentinel policies. So that'll be another central location for you to import these capabilities from. But at a high level, if you're interested and you're just getting started with Sentinel, I would highly recommend copying and pasting the policies from Amit's link there, the Terraform guides, 3rd generation policies from Roger. So there's a couple of standard imports that we talked about, one of which was that JSON import. The other ones are very obvious, like HTTP, so querying or wgetting an HTTP link. Similarly, the ability to import or manage strings. You'll see the JSON one here as I denoted from previous conversation. There's a couple of basic functionalities that you can do on imported data. So these are some programming basics if you're familiar with other languages and how they apply specifically in Sentinel. So one is you can check whether or not a string has a prefix, for example. So validating that a business unit, for example, has been retrieved from the prepend of a Terraform value. So let's say, for example, when your organization builds something, there should be a 3-letter business unit code so that you know who built that infrastructure, either at the beginning or the end of a string, for example. You could also validate the type of a Sentinel object. So checking whether or not it fits the expectation. One of the most powerful endpoints, and one we'll refer to quite often, is the HTTP import. So this is the ability with Sentinel to call another HTTP endpoint and retrieve information. So for example, this essentially allows you to do anything with Sentinel. You could query a ticketing system and validate that a particular post condition comes back. Hey, it looks like a ticket's been submitted, so we can go ahead and provision. You could validate or build a API contract that validates a check script. So let's validate that monitoring's been employed and deployed on this target endpoint. So the HTTP import essentially allows you to query any external endpoint and use that data. And then finally, and you'll be using this with the HTTP import, is the ability to do JSON. So converting JSON and essentially validating it in the Sentinel structure. Just a reminder that if you are using more than one individual HashiCorp product, most, if not all of HashiCorp products use JSON as their underlying framework. The HashiCorp configuration layer is an abstraction above that. So that essentially allows you to consume and use those languages ubiquitously. All right, coming back to our first policy. So we have an import here. We are importing tfconfig functions. So at a high level, we're going out and we're importing a set of common functions called tfconfig, and we're calling those config. So from there, we can see that this config is going to be used later when we go through and find all of our resources. But right now, all we've done is import the tfconfig functions. If there was more functions we would like to import, there is the ability to support these via arrays. Similarly, you could also just do multiple lines. So you can just say import tfconfig, import tfplan, import, et cetera, ad nauseum. So next up, functions. A function allows you to create a reusable set of code. So this is where you might build a common Sentinel function that does something on a repeated structure. It's declared using the func keyword. A couple of examples of common functions are find all resources, for example. So please find all of the resources. Resources is a variable here where it says, find all the virtual machines, or find all of the security groups if you're working with Azure, or find all of the S3 buckets if you're working with AWS. So find all of these resources is a great example of a common function. Each function has essentially 3 structured points. So it has 1, the name of the function, 2, the parameter that it's looking for, and 3, the actual resource type that you'd specifically be looking for. And then finally, the return, but we don't necessarily count that as a capability. So at a high level, this is the name of the function. You have the keyword that's reserved, the thing that it's going to go ahead and find. So this may be something that you substitute in as the individual user. So if we go all the way back to our first policy here, you'll notice that this particular function is going to go ahead and find all of the resources that are not in this list. So earlier there was a question about, hey, if you can test positively, or all the examples right now are positively, can you do the opposite and validate all of the negatives? Absolutely. So whether or not you are testing against the positive. So for example, in your first Sentinel run through with the CLI, you tested, is it odd or is it even? You can test the positive or the negative. You can go the inverse or the actual function against that capability. So at a high level, a function looks a little bit like this. Typically, this is where we say, hey, this is very advanced Sentinel capabilities and very advanced Sentinel running. So all of this is commentary. It's not necessarily important, but this is actually the core function as it was before. So we don't go into this in the initial training, or sorry, the initial workshop. The initial workshop is just focused on introducing you to Sentinel, some of the capabilities, and getting you started copying and pasting some reusable capabilities. If you're interested in an advanced programming or advanced Sentinel functionality, that's a different follow-up course. But the point is, you could either write this function or you can reuse a reusable function. So since this has already been programmed and it's functional and it's great, functional, this gives you the ability to find the resources rather than codifying your own capabilities or functions. So most importantly, when you're importing functions, one, it's written once, you can use it commonly, you can repeat it commonly. To get started, you can use some common functions. So these are the ones that we referenced in the chat. Do note that all of these common functions are aligned with a specific import. So if you need something from the configuration, this functions for that. If there is stuff you need from the plan, this functions for that. Similarly, the run and state. So there was another question earlier in the day about, can we do validation against cost? There's some capabilities that we've extended with the concept of run tasks. Run tasks is an intermediary stage that actually happens pre-plan and post-plan, and it can give us additional information or additional data for Sentinel to retrieve. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in this course, or we haven't possibly not introduced it because it's brand new, but run tasks give you the ability to retrieve additional data and query it using Sentinel. Built-in functions. So there's a couple of built-in functions that you need to be aware of. One, they are reserved words, and two, they provide some of the core functionality of Sentinel. The three probably most important ones that you're going to be using every single day. One, print. For diagnosing, writing, or learning your first policies, print's incredibly valuable because it allows you to send the diagnostic information or the output to the end user that's trying to consume the policy. Next up is values. So values commonly combined with print. Values allow you to retrieve all of the values of an individual map. So say, for example, you've set up all of your variables, but for some reason your test is still not returning information. If you want to dump all of the information that is inside of your map and just manually validate that it's giving you the right information, you can return that through this methodology. And then finally, my favorite is error. So error allows you a checkpoint or a stopgap to just stop a policy in place. So this is a really powerful way to use sort of a validation or checkpoint to see how far you're getting down in a policy. So if this is my first time writing a policy, there's three things that I would do. One, do all of my common imports and usually use somebody else's imports. So in this particular example, I'd probably use Rogers. Two, copy and paste error and print in every single stanza. So this gives me a really good idea of how far I'm getting down in my policy. And then three, always keep values in my back pocket. This gives me a really good diagnostic point, a really good validation point to see whether I'm loading any of my functions or capabilities properly. All right, I'm going to pause here for a moment. Any questions in the chat and or any additional commentary from the TAs? Great, fantastic. So the first concept, we talked about the ability to do imports. The next thing, most important, is defining your criteria. So in this particular list, what we're looking for is AWS instance, Azure virtual machine, and a Google Compute instance. These are my allowed criteria that I'm going to be evaluating against. The next thing I need to do is, once I've gathered my criteria, is get something to evaluate it against. In this particular example, as Nikita had gone over, I need to load the data into the solution in some way. I'm going to load the data into the solution by running a plan. Now remember, Terraform Enterprise and Terraform Cloud runs Sentinel as part of that workflow. So this is automated for you, but you still need to import the data that you want to query. So in this particular example, I'm going to query all the resources. Now, all of the resources is coming from my config function and the find all resources functionality. Remember, this is a common function that is referenceable. So I'm going to go into the Terraform config data. I'm going to go into the the plan data. I'm going to grab all of the resources that exist in that plan data, and I'm going to check them against this allowed list. When you look through this policy, it's actually pretty straightforward, readable code. I'm just getting a set of functions. Here's everything that I want to get. Now I'm going to take all of the existing resources and put them through this filter of what is allowed. And what I'm also going to do is create the other test case. And the other test case in this particular example is all of my violating resources. So my violating resources are any resources that are not in the allowed list. It's fairly straightforward sort of binary evaluation. Either you're approved or you're not approved. Similarly, you could have a list of ports here instead. So say, for example, we want to disable SSH through the entire company, right? For whatever reason, security said, hey, SSH is no longer allowed in the organization. Therefore, all the approved ports would be any that are not SSH or by default 22. And similarly, all the allowed resources would be the ones outside of that. And then the last thing that all Sentinel policies have, or all Sentinel functionality has, is one rule. At a minimum, one rule, but you can have as many rules as you want chained together with and/or gates. But the last piece of this is the rule. And in this particular example, this rule is called main. Typically, it is in all primary examples. And the rule in this particular example is, if there are more than 0 violating resources, print them all out and show me what is violating that error. So let's say, for example, we have a couple of users. We've told them that they can build some VMs on AWS, Azure, and GCP just to validate that the clouds are good and everything's fancy dancy and they can do external provisioning. But some user goes in and starts to build full stacks, or maybe they start to build an S3 bucket. What this Sentinel policy will do is comb through all of the existing Terraform, and when it attempts to provision, alert the end user that they should not be using that resource. Now, a more practical example of this is one that Nikita referenced earlier in the presentation. Let's say, for example, there are beta resources that are being provisioned by Azure. They just introduced a brand new data pipeline management solution or artificial intelligence data ingestion framework. And inside our organization, we haven't certified that resource yet. A good example of how this could be used is putting that in the violating resources list. So you should not be using any unreleased or pre-beta resources as tagged by Microsoft. That'd be a fantastic example of using this policy. So I know that was very long, very detailed. At a very high level, the chapter summary here is a basic rule of thumb for all Sentinel policies is they contain 3 things: imports, so grabbing all of the data and functions that you need; modules, so references to that codified piece; and then evaluation criteria, so evaluating positive or negative; and then one rule. So a rule to validate, did this meet the criteria that I expected? Now remember, because it has one rule doesn't mean it can't have many rules. They can be daisy chained together with and ors as deep as you would wish to go. Also to note, Sentinel has many built-in functions, and there's also common functions. So not only are there HashiCorp employees that have built common functions, but other organizations have exposed their common functions as well for you to reference. And then most importantly here is, if you're using more than one HashiCorp product, Sentinel is actually embedded across the enterprise suite of our products. So you could, excuse me, you could have checks between multiple products. Say, for example, you're using Terraform to provision Vault. You could validate that namespaces inside of Vault fall within that expected guideline. Or maybe you only want to approve certain secret engines inside of Vault. You want to validate that every time a secret engine is added to Vault, it's one of the supported framework. Or you are going through a restructuring process for secrets management, and you want all of the new TTLs to be less than 20 minutes, and you provision those and configure them with Terraform. All of these things could be cross-validated between the product suites. I'm going to pause here for a moment, and we'll take maybe a little bit shorter of a break this time. Feel free, any questions? Again, all of the reference documentation is here. I'll paste it into the chat if you're interested. Otherwise, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break now, and we'll open it for questions both in the chat and the audio if you're interested. And as with all infrastructure as code components, this is a repeatable iterative process. So for example, you might start writing a policy that checks all of the port controls. And then as you go along, you add additional checks. Maybe you want to validate more than one port. Maybe you want to validate an entire stack. It's just an iterative, expansive workflow. So there's 3 ways that you can test your Terraform Sentinel policies. You can manually test policies. So you can go into the Terraform code by using the Terraform UI or Terraform CLI with a remote backend. You could execute automated tests as part of the Terraform API workflow. Or as Nikita mentioned, you can use the Sentinel simulator. So the Sentinel simulator, you would manually download your mocks from TFE or TFC, paste them into the Sentinel simulator, and then go through your iterative testing frameworks by developing. So no one way is better than the other, but the one we're going to be talking about here is the automated invocation methodology. So using the Sentinel simulator with mocks generated from Terraform plans. So when you are in Terraform Cloud or Terraform Enterprise and you invoke Terraform plan will then simultaneously generate you some additional mock data. So you should see it under your actions and your download Sentinel mocks. And this is going to provide you all of the expected data that your Terraform code has created. So what this particular slide is for is this is our guideline of how to write your first Sentinel policy. At a high level, you're going to write some Terraform code. You're going to create a workspace, start your first plan, download the mock from that plan, write a new Sentinel policy, or just copy an existing functionality and test. Create positive and negative test cases. So even if you are just validating a positive test case, make sure that you test against a negative example. A good example of this is, let's say I have a list of all of the supported virtual machine sizes that I want to build. T2 micro, T3 large, T3, etc. But for whatever reason, Amazon or Azure or GCP add a new existing image type that subsequently violates that rule that I wasn't prepared for. So make sure that you test both the positive case, does this pass the rule, and negative, does this failure work against this rule? Number 7, as with logging and monitoring, testing and policy and security is never done. So iterate, 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 and then finally deploy your actual policy. And I always like to joke, there's always a secret step 9 is relax and enjoy that automation is finally working inside your organization. Although, as Nikita had mentioned, automation is never over. You continue to automate no matter how long you've been working at your organization. So let's go through the actual policy writing workflow for Sentinel. So this is at a high level, the authoring workflow diagram. So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to write some Terraform code. This Terraform code could be as simple as testing an individual image. It could be as complex as your entire infrastructure stack, however you've structured your Terraform code, whether that is a monorepo or an individual workspace. The next thing that you're going to do is you need to start a plan, and you need to start a plan so that you can go ahead and generate those mocks. Mock data is just fake data that Sentinel provides, and it's the presumption, it's similar to the plan, which is essentially a no-op run against that target API. So most importantly here is that you're going to get data of the invocation against that target API, but it's not necessarily 100% accurate. This is fairly concrete, but it's not a good representation. That's because we're essentially just running the plan here. You could also get applied data as well and use that as part of your Sentinel validation. But once you get your mock, you're then going to start writing your Sentinel policies. So in this particular example, again, remember, we're looking for all of the images. So we want an AWS instance, we want an Azure instance, and we want a Google instance. These are the allowed resources to be built inside of our organization. I'm going to create a positive test, an AWS instance, and I'm going to create a negative test. So there's no such thing as a Nimbus instance, not yet. Nobody's been as generic as that with their cloud configuration. And I'm then going to upload and configure this policy. Do note that as with all the capabilities and functionalities inside of both Terraform Enterprise and Sentinel, all of these capabilities and functionalities are exposed to the API. So you can codify and programmatically build your Sentinel policies, the workspaces that they action, and impact on, and the workspaces that they consume and are regulated against. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in this overview. So step number one, we're going to go ahead and write some Terraform code. This can be as generic as you'd like. You could define an individual instance, or you could go and validate something else. Now, the most obvious thing here is you need to provision at least one instance of the resource that you'd like to test. So there's no value in provisioning an entire stack and then checking if there's no S3 buckets or resource groups, because unless you have a resource group included or an S3 bucket, you can't go ahead and test against it. The other thing is you would like to set, if possible, 2 sets of instance types. So in this particular example, I'd want to validate against one variable, but again, you can create more than one instance and test both the positive and negative. So let's say, for example, I am testing a subnet group and I want to validate that the port configuration 20 is open and that 21 is closed. I could create 2 instances of this and validate both tests at the same time, or I could modify the mock data, whichever you prefer. So one thing that this training is, or sorry, this workshop is a sort of walk along guide together. So if you're on these slides right now, what this will give you is the step-by-step capabilities to get started writing through your first policy. So you should be able to copy this Terraform configuration or substitute your own Azure or GCP examples and subsequently try these policies along with this. So not only is this a workshop, but it's a reference guide as well for afterwards when you're trying to build your own policies. So just again, I know everybody here is a Terraform expert, some high level terminologies that we're going to be referencing. So 1 is the instance type, 2 is the name, 3 is the occurrences, and 4 are the variables that I'm consuming. So you'll notice there are 2 variables in here, the AMI ID and the instance type. Anything you build with Terraform, you can validate with Sentinel, even if there is not a native object, for example, to reference. So let's say, for example, you're building a custom provider, you are using an obscure tag that we don't have an import for, or anything above those lines. You can also just do a direct import, as you saw previously, with the JSON or with the string and do a regex against that value. So let's say, for example, you want to test some crazy esoteric thing that nobody else is using. If we don't have a native integration for it, you can still do a test against it via HTTP import, string, or regex. So let's go back to our example here. We're creating inside AWS an instance type. We're creating 2 of them. We're going to do 2 different types. And with those 2 different types, I can create both a positive and a negative test validation. Next up, I'm going to set my remote backend to either TFC or TFE. What this is going to do is allow me to use Sentinel. Remember, Sentinel is a enterprise level feature. So that means inside TFC or TFE, it's enabled as part of the workflow. It is not available in the open source. So once I create my workspaces, I'm going to set some variables. Here's where you'll notice I have an array in my particular variable set. I can create a T2 micro. Similarly, you may also modify the mock data. So remember when you were going through that odd number, even number test, you ran the test against both test files. I could either A, run that same test against both test files, or B, modify those test files each time and say, hey, in this particular example, I'd like to test this instance type. And in this particular example, I'd like to test the inverse of that. Maybe it's a failed example, and then provide that output to the end user. So step 3 and 4, you're going to invoke the plan and grab the mock data. And from that mock data, we need to then start writing our Sentinel policy. So in this particular example, there's a common function, and that common function is find all instance types. And I'm going to go ahead and import that function and validate the data against the plan. So I invoked the plan against the Terraform that I wrote, and now I'm going to go ahead and start grabbing that data. I'm going to specify all of the instances that are allowed. So in this particular example, it's T2 small, T2 medium, and T2 large. I'm then going to get all of the instances. So remember, I'm using the plan data. I'm using a common function called find all resources, and I'm going to put that into a variable called AWS instances. And then I'm going to say anything outside of this is broken and or I want to get alerted on and or output to the end user. So if you do use an AWS instance, and you do not use one of these supported types, I'm going to print you out here and put you on a name and shame list. Finally, I'm actually going to do the evaluation and then output the main.rule. So remember, the main.rule is just a catch-all for all evaluations inside of Sentinel, inside of a particular Sentinel policy. So this main.rule is going to print out all of that information or violations against the rule. So that'll be my name and shame list, and that goes down to the end user. So just reviewing the policy that we briefly built there together, there's a couple of common functions that you should be aware of. One is find. So find all resources by a specific type. The next is filter. So look for a particular resource attribute. Remember, when we're building things inside of Terraform, we are referring to the resource type, attributes, which are within the stanza that we're accessing, right? So a virtual machine has instance type, a security group has port configuration, an S3 bucket has public or non-public or encrypted or non-encrypted. And then the attributes are what we're actually evaluating against. So I did a find function to find all my resources. I then want to check their attribute type, and their attribute type is that approved list of resource types. So T2 medium, large, or small. And then I'm going to go ahead and validate those against the criteria that I had. So to test my policy, I can either do a direct test with the Sentinel CLI, the example we showed as part of the previous, or I can invoke it inside of TF Cloud, TF Enterprise. Let me just show the example here. There we are. So when I run it with the Sentinel CLI, I can run two test commands. I can test against my existing mock data, and I can also test against my modified mock data with either a verbose command or the trace command that we showed previously. And what this is going to output is some pass or fail data, giving me a high level information about whether or not the Terraform code that I wrote fits within my policies. And then remember that this is an iterative loop. So every time you add new resources, you could write Sentinel policies to validate this. One of the things that we were working on here at HashiCorp is two styles of sort of implementation and consumption of Terraform. One is a service catalog. So the ability for a centralized IT team to provide what I like to call sort of the McDonald's vending machine of infrastructure. You come in, you request a specific stack. Maybe there are some tunables and you vend that out to the end user. Or the other option is you allow your end users to provision directly and you write a significant amount of Sentinel upfront. And when you do this second option, what this essentially allows you to do is allow any end user to provision, but you control them with a central sort of regulation or regulated IT team. And this essentially is the model that most of us recommend now is open provisioning. So anybody can consume and use Terraform and Terraform Enterprise, but a central team is writing just an innumerable amount of policies to sort of keep them on safe guide rails inside of the organization. So I know that was a very dense chapter. This is where we typically transition into the labs. I think we're going to be doing lab 1 here first, but let's go ahead and take another 10-minute break, and then we'll get started on doing our first policy inside of the Instruct lab. Go over the solution to the lab in depth first thing tomorrow. Tomorrow is a lot more of hands-on interactive workloads. So today we were laying down the theory and giving you the basics. Tomorrow will be primarily labs. So again, we'll be starting at the same time tomorrow. The Zoom link will be provided. No other additional content today, and we'll be following up tomorrow and providing the solution to day number 1. With that, we're good to close off today, and thank you all very much.
Thank you, everybody.